The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Hey friends, Jonathan Rogers here. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a new online writing class that I've put together. It's called Writing with Hobbits. Over 6 weeks, starting August 18th, we'll read The Hobbit together, and we'll talk about the principles by which Tolkien works his particular kind of magic as a writer. Then we'll apply those principles to our own writing. I'd love to see you there. Find out more at thehabit.co/hobbits. Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Christine Flanagan is an English professor at the University of the Sciences in Pennsylvania. She's the editor of the Letters of Flannery O'Connor and Caroline Gordon, published by the University of Georgia Press. O'Connor's letters have long been among my favorite things she ever wrote, but in this collection, Caroline Gordon's letters to O'Connor are the real showstopper. The Letters of Flannery O'Connor and Caroline Gordon bring to light a vital literary influence that a lot of O'Connor's most ardent fans don't know much about. Christine Flanagan, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast with me.
Thank you, Jonathan.
I so enjoyed your book, The Letters of Flannery O'Connor and Caroline Gordon. And my listeners are probably pretty familiar with Flannery O'Connor. She comes up very often on this podcast, but probably not as familiar with Caroline Gordon or Carolyn Gordon. So tell us about, who was Caroline Gordon? What was her relationship to Flannery O'Connor? It's a great story.
I can tell you, Caroline Gordon was an unfamiliar name to me as well. As many of your listeners as well, Flannery O'Connor was the familiar name. And years ago, there was an anthology published called Letters to a Fiction Writer, edited by the late Frederick Bush. And in that book, there are a series of letters from fiction writers to fiction writers, and they're, mentoring and giving advice on writing and life. And there was a letter from Caroline Gordon to Flannery O'Connor, this long letter, which is one of the first letters in my book. I think it was written in November 1951. I think the original document is something like 9 pages, single-space typed. It's about 4,000 words, which, is about, 60, right? 4,000 words, 16 pages, right, or so, typed. And it was this unbelievable door that opened for me. Who was this woman who gave such advice to Flannery O'Connor, this Caroline Gordon? So she stayed with me for years. And then as I went to work on Flannery O'Connor, doing different scholarship on landscapes and ecological ideas in O'Connor, I kept running into moments of Caroline Gordon in the archives. So I found out, among many other writers who have gone the way of the past, she's not widely read or taught today. Even during her life, she was she was called the wife of Alan Tate. But during her life, she published 2 collections of short stories, 10 novels, 2 books of nonfiction. She was a person who was asked to write the front page book review on the New York Times, book review of Faulkner's work. She's the person who brought attention to Faulkner outside of the South. She's the person who was asked to write the introduction to an American edition of Madame Bovary. She was highly accomplished. She won a Guggenheim in 1932. She had a story nominated for the O. Henry Prize. In my introduction to my book, I write a lot about in 1952, she was nominated for the National Book Award. So 1 year after she met Flannery O'Connor, she was nominated for the National Book Award. And the other nominees were Faulkner, Capote, Salinger. Her editor for 20 years was Maxwell Perkins, and that is the famous literary editor of Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Thomas Wolfe. So I could go on.
Yeah.
Who is this woman who has become invisible?
Yeah.
In so many ways. So she had this incredible achievement, and then she and her husband, Alan Tate, the poet, they lived in New York, they lived in Paris, they lived in Rome, they were friends with Hart Crane, E.E. Cummings.
Right, you left off Nashville. They lived in Nashville.
Nashville, of course, was where, outside of Nashville, was Ben Foley, their home, where they had other writers come to live with them, like Ford Madox Ford, Robert Lowell. I mean,
Robert Lowell lived in a tent in their front yard, right?
He lived in a tent on their front yard. He just showed up, and because Alan Tate said, someone said, if you want to learn to write, you should really go talk to Alan Tate. And so came, and they said there's no room because Ford Madox Ford and her girlfriend was in the house, and they had a million people coming in and out. And so Robert Lowell just opened a tent and lived on the front lawn. And this infuriated Ford Madox Ford. Caroline Gordon and Alan Tate said, well, he seems like a nice guy. So they celebrated Thanksgiving with the Hemingways in Paris. I mean, the life she led with her husband, who she married twice and divorced twice, is just this incredible experience. Add to that, she taught at over 20 different universities, writing conferences, and this is in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. She's incredibly accomplished. She earned her bachelor's degree in classics. She was fluent in Greek and Latin. So here this is Caroline Gordon. So in the world of literary circles, people knew who Caroline Gordon was. Mm-hmm. They knew her. But she's one of these people who has disappeared.
Yeah. It's amazing to me to think about. We think of Flannery O'Connor as being this sort of lone genius, off by herself, and in some ways she cultivated that reputation. And I think about what she said to the editor John Selby. When he tried to help her, and his idea of helping her was sort of changing the way she wrote, and she spoke of the peculiarity and the aloneness from which I write. She said,
Yes. She didn't like Selby very much.
Yes, before she met Caroline Gordon, just a few months before she met her.
Right. John Selby was the editor, the publisher, she said he treated her like a slightly dim-witted campfire girl.
Yeah. He said he accused her of being prematurely arrogant.
Absolutely.
Although she also said she supplied the praise.
She was prematurely arrogant.
Yeah.
Her.
Yeah, right.
Good for her.
Yeah.
She certainly was in 1950 to speak that way to a publisher.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
But it's so amazing to think about through Caroline Gordon, she suddenly is connected, just 1 degree of separation from everybody.
And it starts with her relationship with the Fitzgerald. So I'm going to go into the weeds if anybody likes Flannery O'Connor trivia, right? So Flannery O'Connor, everyone knows, went to Iowa and Yaddo, and then she met Sally and Robert Fitzgerald, who became her lifelong friends. And Fitzgerald was her literary executor, and Sally Fitzgerald is the one who edited Habit of Being. It was through the Fitzgeralds that O'Connor and Gordon connected. O'Connor was having trouble. O'Connor didn't know it. Harcourt Brace had wanted to publish her book. This is the first book, Wise Blood. Robert Giroux was the editor at the time, and he was having trouble. He wanted to publish her book, and people at the publisher found the book shocking. They found Wise Blood disturbing from a young lady. They didn't understand it, and Giroux, who liked O'Connor's work, she had been published in reputable journals. She had a good pedigree. She had a master's degree from Iowa. She had the Fitzgeralds and Robert Lowell speaking up on her behalf, but he really didn't know what to do. So behind the scenes, Sally Fitzgerald writes in her unpublished biography of O'Connor, Sally Fitzgerald writes about there was sort of something going on in the background at Harcourt Brace with Wise Blood. And Robert Fitzgerald is the one who had the idea to send the novel to Caroline Gordon. He had just taught with her at a writer's conference. I want to say Alan Tate is the godfather of one of Robert and Sally Fitzgerald's children. So they had a close relationship, Catholic intellectuals, writers. Robert Fitzgerald asks O'Connor, is this okay? Can I send this novel, The Draft of Wise Blood, to this writing teacher and writer, Caroline Gordon? And O'Connor says yes. And that begins. That's where it begins. Caroline Gordon writes back immediately to Fitzgerald and says, this girl has talent. This is, good stuff. Writes a fairly long assessment, opening assessment. Like, I think 2 scenes are really she says, I think she's muffed 2 scenes, and a little revision that could go on, but she endorses Wise Blood completely.
Yeah.
That letter goes to Robert Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald sends it to Giroux at Harcourt Brace. Harcourt Brace accepts the novel, and it is Giroux who sends the suggestions then on to O'Connor. And Gordon says, I'd be happy to read it again.
Yeah.
And
okay, so we've been talking about Gordon's connectedness. But I want to sort of shift to talk about what she did for Flannery O'Connor as a mentor, sort of in the craft of writing. Because I love that story. I didn't, until I read your introduction, I didn't know about Caroline Gordon's role in sort of breaking that logjam for Wise Blood. And that's super.
It's another moment of invisibility.
Yeah.
It's another moment of you'll see that I'm a bit of a Caroline Gordon fan. It's another moment where she is not credited in the way that other people would have been. The number of times I've read short biographies, here's Flannery O'Connor on Wikipedia or wherever, where people credit Alan Tate or her Iowa teachers, the ones who said they didn't really like Wise Blood. They really thought she shouldn't work on it. And Caroline Gordon's name is never mentioned. And she never sought that for herself. She never did any of this for her own self-promotion.
Yeah. It's so apparent from your work just how generous she was, Caroline. I mean, these letters she wrote, the detail, it's just shocking how detailed.
Jonathan, I feel like writers and the listeners of your podcast who are writers would understand this. And I think this is a way that scholars and writers are different. Maybe not. When I was in graduate school, and my best teacher in graduate school wrote me 9 pages of critique and comments on a short story that changed the way I wrote forever. The value of that And the number of times we have that in this life as writers are so few.
Yeah.
And the amount of time, as you know, you're a teacher too, the amount of time it takes to invest that kind of thought in someone else's writing. So yeah, the generosity is just mind-blowing. If all Gordon did was to write Flannery O'Connor that single letter in November 1951, where she gives her feedback and she says, you're pretty much done, Wise Blood. So this is kind of for your future work. She's being very diplomatic. She's saying, think about this for your future work, but I'll talk about Wise Blood and I'll use some examples. That single letter is a masterclass in creative writing. And it's just phenomenal. And then that went on for 13 years, on and off. It wasn't every single story that had that amount. But if you jump forward to 1964, when O'Connor is looking for feedback on Parker's back and she's writing it in the hospital, and Caroline Gordon surprises her by just showing up at the hospital to visit O'Connor in July 1964. And O'Connor gets some feedback from her usual people on Parker's back. Something's not right. She still sends her final story to Caroline Gordon. And Gordon writes feedback, which is a letter, one of the last letters in my book, and it's 4,000 words. Feedback, once again, 13 years later.
Yeah.
And Caroline Gordon, knowing she's sick, also says, here's a short version. Here's the long version of comments. Here's the short version. And then she also realizes O'Connor's on her deathbed. And so she finally just sends a quick telegram. You have succeeded, so.
Wow. Another actor.
She learned that, you talk about generosity. Caroline Gordon did the same thing for Walker Percy. Same month, she wrote Flannery O'Connor, that first big chunk of feedback on Wise Blood. She wrote a longer letter to Walker Percy about his work.
Her first introduction to Percy and O'Connor came the same week, right? Or does that move?
It's really interesting. Her first made these big letters that were critiques, both come the same month. She writes essentially about 50 pages of critiques for these two writers in 2 letters the same month.
2 writers who had either one published a novel yet?
No, neither one had published yet. She had known Walker Percy and his family. Walker was actually paying her, which many people don't know. So
really?
She had said, because at this point, again, Caroline Gordon is very accomplished at this point in time, 51, she's pretty accomplished. And so she thinks, I'll charge people, for my, she didn't charge O'Connor, but she did. I think she charged Walker Percy $100, and I think she said, I'm donating it to the church or something like that.
Uh-huh.
But, we can go back to Ford Maddox Ford, who was Caroline Gordon's mentor.
Mm-hmm.
She started working for him as his secretary in 1927. She was 31. She had published no fiction yet. She had been publishing as a journalist for 10 years. And she met Ford Maddox Ford, began working as his secretary. And during this time period, it's everything from retyping his handwritten manuscripts. Imagine how much you would learn retyping manuscripts of Ford Maddox Ford. Or he would dictate to her, and she would sit there and type while he dictated his fiction to her. Imagine what she must have learned there. But he didn't only teach her writing. And then when he heard she was writing, he made her show him his work. And he, there's a great story in my introduction about how he sort of took her by the scruff of the neck and said, you sit down, you're writing fiction, you sit down, now you're dictating to me. And but he also showed her what a writer's community was. And again, this is something I think you really understand, Jonathan, that a community for Ford Maddox Ford was, you come to Paris, I'm not there, you're staying in my apartment. Mm-hmm. Friends, we share food together. You come to Clarksville, Tennessee, and Ford Maddox Ford and his wife, you're staying for months on end, our extended family. When Gordon first published, when she published her first novel, Ford Maddox Ford wrote an endorsement of it saying, this is the best constructed American novel I've ever seen. He just gave her these kinds of support. And so I think Gordon really learned what it was to be a writer in the most expansive way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about one specific bit of advice that Caroline Gordon gave to Flannery O'Connor. Because I can't imagine that Flannery O'Connor needed this advice. And well, anyway, and I couldn't locate it in the book, but I remember it, and I remember you talking about it at something I heard you speak at, where she talks about Gordon says to O'Connor, in your story, it feels like I'm looking through. It's like you're a burglar with a flashlight. I'm just seeing immediately what you need. I'm not seeing the landscape. I'm only seeing exactly what you're showing me at the moment.
Yes.
That is so. It's amazing to me that O'Connor. I think of her as being a person who's so strong on place and atmosphere. It's hard to imagine her ever needing that advice. And did she?
So you're right.
The fact that Caroline Gordon is the one who told her that. Anyway.
That specific advice came in 1951 as O'Connor was revising Wise Blood. So it was early in her career. And I would attribute many of O'Connor's achievements to the teaching of Gordon. And the use of landscape and setting is one very specific way. We can see in letter after letter, Gordon giving her this advice, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Gordon is telling O'Connor, and I love this writing advice, you can't write in a vacuum. You have to imitate God. You have to create a whole world or the illusion of a whole world. And she says about Wise Blood, it's like, she says, I love the dramatic action of the book, but I think the whole book would gain if it weren't so stripped bare. Surround the core of action with contrasting material. And then she goes and she says this passage. Suppose we think of a scene in your novel as a scene in a play. Any scene takes place on a kind of set. I feel that the sets in your play are wonderful, but you never let us see them. A spotlight follows every move the characters make and throws a blinding radiance on them. But it's a little like a spotlight a burglar uses when he's working a safe. It illuminates a small circle, and the rest of the stage is in darkness most of the time. Focusing the reader's attention completely on the action is one way to make things seem very dramatic, but you can't keep that up all the time. She says it demands too much of the reader. It would be better, she says, if you occasionally used a spotlight large enough to illuminate the corners of the room, for those corners have gone on existing all through the most dramatic moments. And this is advice. I love this advice. I've written plays and I've taught playwriting as well. I always ask my creative writing students, like, what are the props? What's on the stage? What else is, corner? What's above? What's below? Yeah. She will come back to this piece of advice in different ways, but what a phenomenal piece of advice. She's talking about setting.
Yeah.
Saying, look at Chekhov's story, look at Madame Bovary. She'll say, landscape reflecting the mood can get monotonous. If you have a fighting couple and the weather is stormy, that can get monotonous. She'll say, also use some contrasting material in the setting.
So it feels to me like if you're the person who convinced Flannery O'Connor to do that, you're kind of the person who made Flannery O'Connor. I mean,
I've said it time and time again, and I don't mean it as a dismissal of O'Connor's talent. I don't mean to disregard her achievement, but Flannery O'Connor would not be Flannery O'Connor without Caroline Gordon. I think that is just unquestionable, but I've seen the manuscripts. So I've seen the manuscripts, the letters, and the final version. The amount that I've learned from Caroline Gordon in writing is just so expansive. I love, she'll go back to that burglar, that spotlight though, and say things like, in Madame Bovary, she'll describe a scene where Flaubert has Emma, and the spotlight is on a few characters, and all of a sudden they hear the sound of a rooster outside in the distance. And Caroline Gordon says it makes a scene more dramatic to go outside of it with description. You don't just have to stay within that scene. She'll use examples from James Joyce to illustrate this. When I edited Caroline Gordon's letters to O'Connor, I have a reading list. I don't know if I'll finish it in my lifetime. The writers I should read for advice on writing.
Wow. Did you find her, sometimes in reading through your book, it felt like her advice was so technical. It was kind of hard. Sometimes it was hard to find out ways to apply because it was so technical.
It was technical. And this goes back to Caroline Gordon went to school at 10 she attended a classical preparatory school for boys at 10. Her father taught there. She knew Greek, Latin. She knew sentence structure. She will diagram sentences for O'Connor, telling O'Connor where the language goes wrong. She will talk about loose and periodic sentences. And she will say, I might be didactic, blah, blah, blah. A lot of people, and I think rightly so, conclude that O'Connor was put off and a little alienated by these kind of specific comments. You can't use the word squinch. You can't use the word slurped. URPED. The omniscient narrator would never, Gordon is always harping on the omniscient narrator would never speak this way. But you know what? Gordon's right. And there's a reason why James Joyce is James Joyce. When you look at Araby and you read the final sentence, that is not the character's voice. That is the omniscient narrator's voice. And so Gordon understood these layers of technicality that I'm still trying to learn. So I think she's called pedantic. People say she alienated others with this sort of critique. And I do not, I'm not ashamed to say, I love this kind of feedback on my writing. Mm-hmm. Tell me what word to put at an end of a sentence because it's going to make, a powerful impact. And I think this is the difference between writers like Nabokov and Joyce and Toni Morrison and other writers, that they care about the work on a sentence level. And Caroline Gordon was not always successful in her own writing. I think where Caroline Gordon was successful was in the technical elements and maybe not as successful in those dramatic moments that O'Connor so achieved.
And so do you see evidence in O'Connor's letters back to that she's in any way alienated or offended by some of these comments?
Never to Gordon. Mm-hmm. In The Habit of Being, and other places she'll say, I think there's O'Connor writes something around 1961. She is working on the memoir of Marianne, writing the introduction, and she says something about Caroline Gordon, like she will sacrifice anything to grammar. She's so hung up on grammar.
Yeah.
So there is evidence that, O'Connor stepped away a bit.
Yeah.
And there's evidence that Gordon said to her very clearly, damn it, what's wrong? Can't you get what I told you? Gordon she did not sugarcoat her criticism, and O'Connor was good with that. That was okay. But at a certain point, I think it did space them apart. The flip side is Caroline Gordon was the age of Flannery O'Connor's mother. Uh-huh. Gordon had a daughter, O'Connor's age. So they were not peers. They were not, Catherine Ann Porter and Caroline Gordon. Dorothy Day and Caroline Gordon were friends, peers. They were not close in that way. Caroline Gordon was never officially O'Connor's teacher. And they did not have a mother-daughter relationship. They never had that kind of a relationship either. So O'Connor always treated Gordon with respect. Even, she'd complain about her to her friends, like everybody will, right, about other people.
Yeah.
She always maintained respect for Gordon. She would even defend Gordon when things were particularly difficult for Gordon in her personal life.
Yeah.
I would call that a real relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where people, honestly communicate, and sometimes you need space from each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did Gordon alienate O'Connor? The simple answer is yes. You can interpret that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But would return to, at the end of her life, who is she sending her final story to?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she knew Gordon always had her best intentions when it came to fiction and fiction writing.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, this is my next to last question, because I always end up with this same last question. You, in your introduction, you remarked that while there were so many people who didn't get what Flannery O'Connor was doing, Caroline Gordon was never puzzled by her work. She got it from the start, which is not an easy. I mean, there aren't many people who got it from the start. I mean, Brainerd Cheney could get it, right off, but.
No, I did not get Wise. First time I read Wise Blood, I did not get it from the start.
Sure.
Caroline Gordon, I write, that her O'Connor's work would never puzzle Gordon, and I think there's a number of reasons why. The most simplistic reason, strangely enough, is that they were both Catholics, and they saw themselves not just as Orthodox Catholics. Caroline Gordon was a convert. What they saw themselves, O'Connor later on, but Gordon saw herself as a Catholic intellectual, and she occupied a space with other Catholic intellectuals like Robert Fitzgerald, who was translating the Iliad and the Odyssey, like Jacques Maritain, who famously wrote Art and Scholasticism. He was, arguably the greatest Catholic intellectual on both sides of the Atlantic at the time, and was close friends with Gordon and Tate.
He was their godparent when
Jacques Maritain and his wife were Alan Tate's godparents.
Oh, okay.
So there is the idea of being a Catholic, and that had some intellectual capacity to it. Mm-hmm. This is something that I think is lost today. That's another conversation, though. The second part of why Gordon got O'Connor, though, goes back to Gordon's classical education. Gordon studied and the classics, and think about it. No one has ever said of Homer, those characters are grotesque, like really violent.
Yeah.
Cyclops is violent. Never once did Gordon say of O'Connor's work that it was violent or grotesque.
Interesting.
Had that classical background, and Gordon immediately that her understanding of classical works fused with her Catholic sensibilities. Mm-hmm. People don't go around saying the Bible has a bunch of really grotesque characters in it. Boy, is that fine, right? So these are the things Gordon understood. She understood that storytelling was to communicate a purpose. And so when she read O'Connor's work, she immediately understood, she's trying to achieve these effects. She's trying to say these things. And she wasn't hung up by, wow, this is a really strange character.
Yeah.
And she said very clearly, I think Gordon said, and it was later on in their relationship, Gordon said, there's only one plot in all of fiction. She says, scheme of redemption.
Yeah.
Any other
Gordon
plot?
said that?
Gordon said that.
Yeah.
Any other plot, if it's any good, are splinters off the basic plot. And she really felt this way. So
that sounds like, I had to ask, because it's something O'Connor would say, or probably did say in History of Manners somewhere.
Exactly, yes.
And one thing I was thinking about, and again, I'm quoting from your introduction, and you're quoting Caroline Gordon, who says, "I think I've been converted partly by my own work, too. I have lived most of my life on the evidence of things not seen, and what else is writing a novel but that?" Which, again, sounds like something O'Connor would say. Like, if you showed me that and said, "Is this from Mystery or Manners or from somewhere else?" I would say Mystery or Manners.
Exactly. So that's exactly why these two women were they just got each other. O'Connor knew immediately that Gordon was a reader who understood a vision that O'Connor couldn't even articulate in 19.
Yeah.
And I want to say in O'Connor's first letter to Caroline Gordon, she says, when she's thanking Gordon, saying, "Thanks very much for writing to me about Wise Blood." And she says, the one thing, this is Flannery O'Connor, says, "The one thing that has concerned me is that my novel Wise Blood might be recognized by Catholics as a proper effort for a Catholic."
I'm sorry, might not be recognized
to write a Catholic novel. Yeah. And so Flannery O'Connor is saying to Gordon, "Thanks. I'm so glad you got it. You understood it."
Yeah. Okay, I said that was my next. This is my next to last question. When you read Mystery and Manners, do you just see Caroline Gordon everywhere in that?
I see Gordon everywhere in O'Connor. Gordon everywhere in O'Connor. And this, I think I could spend my life just finding ways in which they make sense to one another. Caroline Gordon published a book called How to Read a Novel. Trying to remember what year that was, the 1950s, 1957, How to Read a Novel. It was just republished recently. And O'Connor read that, and she wrote a book review of it. I forget if the book review was published or not. But O'Connor said she passed that book along to her friends. Read the book by Gordon, How to Read a Novel. It's really more about writing, not about reading.
Yeah.
So
I'll check that out. I don't know that.
Flannery O'Connor sort of understood her equally.
Yeah. When I so here's some praise for your book. When I read Mystery Manners, I've always thought, man, there's nobody like Flannery. There's nobody who thinks like Flannery O'Connor. This is just she is a species of one. And then I read what you've put together, and I think, not true. She was not a species of one. She was a species of at least two. Because your book has changed the way I think about O'Connor's place in the sort of intellectual and literary world. So thank you.
And again, I think that to understand the role a mentor can have does not discredit that writer's achievement. I think we see this, all the time, but we also see it and hear about it in sort of a vague way, like so-and-so was the mentor of. I'm going to give you a compliment. I loved, it's funny, I love archives, and I knew I had read your book years ago, A Spiritual Biography of Flannery. And so I Googled, I was like, what did I say? What did I do? What did I write? And I found an email I had written to myself in 2014, jotting down notes on your book. Specifically that you had written, your observation of Flannery O'Connor is that she invites us to step into mysteries, but she never resolves them, and she never reduces them to something manageable. I just love that. And I love that I found it in my own archives. And that's one of the ways Caroline Gordon understood O'Connor as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, we've arrived at the last question, and I've warned you.
Yes.
Who are the writers who make you want to write?
Changes all the time. Always different. Anything by my teachers. My best teachers are Thomas Gavin, Melanie Ray Tone, Jessica Treadway. Jessica Treadway actually has a new book out right now called The Gretchen Question. Those are three fiction writers. Every time I read their work, you could put a note in your notes for the podcast. Anytime I read anything by those three writers, I am reminded by the craftsmanship of writing and the teaching and the generosity that they showed me as well.
Yeah.
Right now, this year, very specifically, What I do is I get obsessed with a certain piece, and then I want to crack apart that piece. I cut it apart by scenes. I tape it to a wall. I look at each scene individually. I sort of move around. So I'm looking at a lot of nonfiction, but specifically Leslie Jamison's essay, 52 Blue, is the thing that makes me want to write. I want to understand what she did and how she did it. And it is just a phenomenal essay, 52 Blue. You can Google it.
Okay.
Today, that's the writer who is making me really want to think about writing.
I will check that out. All right, Christine Flanagan, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much, and I love your podcast. Keep on.
Well, thanks.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.